A storm has hit the EU. How to penalize Iran after protests fail to topple the Iranian regime. Some EU politicians, represented by Germany, support the IRGC being placed on a terrorist watch list. But, first, a court must approve the IRGC blacklist, according to Josep Borrell, the High Representative. Before the EU may take action, the European Court of Justice must endorse the decision. You cannot claim that just because you don't like me, I view you as a terrorist. The key takeaway is that the conflict over Iran is tied to the West's inability to remove President Putin and subject Russia to a humiliating turnabout. Therefore, there must be a scapegoat to shoulder the blame. Furthermore, blaming Iranian drones and threatening to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization serve the larger goal of sending a strong message from the US to Middle Eastern states that they must cut ties with Russia. Just as it was during the EU infighting between France and the UK at the start of the 2006 conflict, the politics of the entire region are currently being negatively impacted. With 13 governments lining up to join the BRICS, which is quickly emerging as the majority of the G20 and serving as a political and economic bloc in opposition to the US-led international system, the conflict of with us or against is once again accentuated. The economic advantages of cheap energy, China's potential investment and sound money can fuel a new Pan-Asia industrial revolution. But, at the same time, the West will have to decide between a paradigm shift for which the political elite is unprepared and a return to the bust-slash-boom cycle. The European Union is in big trouble, according to Viktor Orbán, Hungary's Prime Minister. It must comprehend that Russia can neither afford nor accept defeat. Russia has time on its side. Russia is a sizable nation with a sizable army at its disposal. There are already insufficient soldiers in Ukraine. What happens next if it occurs? Orbán stated plainly, they, the Europeans, don't know who they are. When asked to characterize themselves in terms of the conflict, they would respond, I am the leader of a country standing on the right side of history, Orbán said. Their thinking is driven by this conviction, intense pressure from Washington, and fear of the liberal media, not by consideration of what would be best for their own countries. Orbán was referring to the fact that the German leadership is aware that it has no business becoming embroiled in a war with Russia but is unable to refuse Washington for whatever reason. The NATO nations will have to decide whether to send troops to fight for Ukraine if Russia's upcoming spring onslaught is successful. A rising proportion of Europeans, whose nations stand to be decimated if war breaks out, are conscious of this. The West and Russia are at war. That is the truth. We are getting closer every day, says Orbán. Moscow first believed the light forces Russia employed in the early phases of the special military operation would be sufficient to persuade Kyiv to request peace. However, that was before NATO brought additional weapons and mercenaries to the conflict. The Russians immediately took a step back, withdrew their expeditionary forces, and shifted their attention to eliminating the AFUs, Armed Forces of Ukraine, personnel and equipment. Incapable of taking strategic action, the AFU resorted to fighting territorial conflicts along the Donbas front. The outcome was massive damage to the AFU's personnel and equipment. Stalin's strategy was to continuously apply pressure along a whole front in the hope that weakness could be identified and taken advantage of. The NATO member states' stockpile of outdated Soviet weapons depleted. Kyiv's backers doubled down and sent volunteers and ever-improving Western equipment. However, since there is no longer a comparable Ukrainian army, no new NATO plan exists. The only thing the West can do is keep attempting to lead the Russians into the same mess they made months ago. The next phase of the larger financial war, the intention to implement a simple, gold-linked digital currency, for real-time clearing between Asian central banks, superseding earlier notions of a commodity-linked trade currency, are having the same unintended consequences that Washington's massive sanctions on Russian energy and the banning of Russian banks from SWIFT had. However, Iran and Russia have just linked their respective national financial messaging systems. The system for transfer of financial messages, the Russian version of SWIFT, now connects 106 Russian banks with 52 Iranian institutions, SPFS. The original Western financial effort to destroy the Russian economy backfired by increasing energy costs in favor of Western competitors. However, if implemented, Russia's next move poses the greatest threat to Western financial markets, commodities prices, and eventual currency collapse. Simply put, NATO's hasty actions, such as exacerbating the situation in Ukraine, might serve as a pretext for assuring Russia's future as an Asian superstate, which would ultimately spell the end for fiat currencies.